Welcome, traveler! If your quest has brought you to this video today, I must assume you are looking for some good, epic fantasy books. Your heart yearns for the maps. Your soul longs for the sword. You want to see empires fall. Maybe you've read Fourth Wing and Acotar and now you want more. Or maybe you're tired of only seeing those two series recommended everywhere and you're looking for something else. Today I will be your humble wizard guide, your morally great tour leader to guide you through the epic realm of fantasy books. My name is Leonie, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, hello! So for this little epic fantasy guide, I have recommendations that are very similar to Fourth Wing and Acotar if you want that vibe, but we're going to take this journey all the way to like the outer parts of the map where we're going into more like in-depth world building epic fantasy. Something for everyone. There are many roads to take on your quest to your new fantasy obsession. So in this video, I am mostly going to be focusing on high fantasy, so specifically fantasy that takes place in a completely different world. So not something that starts in our world or is paranormal. We're also skipping the cozy fantasy books and the atmospheric fantasy books. I have a separate video with recommendations for that type of fantasy. So the first step that we are taking on our epic fantasy journey is still very close to Fourth Wing and Acotar. This is if you're looking for more of that, basically fantasy with a very strong romantic subplot, a little bit spicy, but still like a very cool own world. All of the books that we're gonna be talking about today have like a strong own cool world. That's like kind of the point of epic fantasy. But on this first step, we're not going into crazy world building yet. For this first little dip into the outer world, I will recommend Serpent and the Wings of Night by Carissa Broadbent, or honestly, anything by Carissa Broadbent, but we'll get there. So Serpent and the Wings of Night is to this day still the only like very well-known romantasy book that I actually really enjoy. Here you are taken to the world of vampires. Carissa Broadbent paints this world that is ruled by many different gods, and in this book specifically the country is led by the god of death and night and vampires, and we follow Oraya, who is basically one of the only humans in this vampire world, so that is kind of dangerous. It has that super fun, high action vibe that we specifically get in Fourth Wing, because Oraya has to go through these trials against like hundreds of other vampires, and we have many action-packed, fast-paced scenes where she has to basically survive against all odds. But we get that fantasy element of the vampires. The vampires also have magic. It's all very bloodthirsty, and then of course there's also a really good romance in here because she falls in love with guess what? One of the vampires, of course, and I really liked their romance. They have so much banter. It is a slow burn, but still like delightfully spicy. If you really liked Fourth Wing and Acotar and you just want that next book that gives you a similar vibe, give this one a try. I've also read two other romantasy books by her, Killing the Vampire Conqueror and Six Scorched Roses, which I also enjoyed, but this one is the best one. We are continuing our journey, taking a second step away from the original two books, our starting point. The forest is getting a little bit darker, the mountains a little bit more magical, but there are a few roads you can take on this step away from the center. The first road away is when you actually want more romance than Fourth Wing and Acotar. You loved the romance aspects of those. You really ship Xaden and Violet. You love the big focus on romance in the Acotar books. There were too many dragons actually in Fourth Wing. You just wanted to focus on the characters and their romance. Then these are my recommendations. First, I would recommend Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross. Apparently people named Rebecca write good fantasy romance books. Here we are transported to a world that I found is kind of akin to the 50s, like 50s England. It has a kind of historical 50s vibe, not necessarily your typical medieval or Renaissance fantasy vibe. There is a little bit of magic. It's not super epic, but the magic appears in the form of magical typewriters, but also gods that reign over the people and that are at war with each other. Magic is something the people are kind of subjected to, its whims. But most of the story is very much focused on these two young people that work as journalists at the same gazette, and they don't really like each other, but they are sending each other letters through a magical typewriter, and they don't know who the person is on the other end of the typewriter, but they are falling in love through these pen pal letters that they send each other. It is very romantic to the point that I genuinely cried because I was just so like, this is so beautiful. Oh, love in desperate times. It's that kind of book. It will kind of rip your heart out in that sense. So if you want like the high fantasy elements, but mostly focus on the romance, Divine Rivals is really nice. It doesn't have any spice though, in case you were looking for that. And then I'm gonna be honest, I have a very hard time recommending these kinds of books because I have read a lot of books that are fantasy but more focused on the romance, and to be frank, I didn't really enjoy many of them. So that's why the only other one that I'm going to recommend here is one that already kind of breaks the rule that I said here, because it does take place in our world. So it's technically not high fantasy, but if you just want that magic element, but basically you just want to read a romance novel that just has a little bit of magic in it, I'm just gonna recommend this one again. The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches. It has witches and magic and magical witches and magical children witches that have to learn magic for the first time. And we have like an adult witch that falls in love with the librarian at an orphanage that she works at. It's very focused on, it follows the same formula as a regular romance novel does. So maybe if you mostly read like regular romance novels like Emily Henry say, this one is basically like that, except it has magic. Could be a nice foray into fantasy. A little step in there, a little dipping the toe in the pond, in the magical pond, if you will. But maybe you don't want to take that road towards more fantasy. Maybe the other road that you want to take on your second step away from Fourth Wing and acotar is actually more towards epic fantasy. You loved the actiony fantasy parts, the dragons, the fae, the action scenes, the sitting on the edge of your seat, learning about the different fae courts, following Violet as she goes to war on her dragon, and all these different dragon abilities that people have. Then I have a bunch of really nice recommendations for you for fantasy books that have romantic subplots, but they're not the main focus. And the world building is also not super intricate yet. These are like, to me, the kind of perfect middle ground fantasy where you still get that nice romance subplot without it taking over the book. And you get a really cool, originally crafted world without making you absolutely completely confused the first 100 pages. Okay, first off, let's start with the one that Man, it's been a while since I made a video recommending this book, and I'm so glad that I finally get to do it again. If you are just getting into fantasy, you need to read the best ones. Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom. Just anything by Lee Bardugo is fantastic, but these ones, perfect. It's also a duology, so you don't immediately have to like commit to like 6 books, which is nice. So in Six of Crows, we are transported to a world that is inspired by Golden Age Amsterdam, actually. Very funny to read as a Dutch person myself. It's a very urban fantasy world. We follow manipulators, gamblers, thieves, murderers in the kind of the underbelly of this magical Amsterdam. There are people with elemental abilities, people who can heal, people who can steal your blood away. But what I actually like about this book is that a lot of the characters that we follow don't have magic, but they do have something up their sleeves and a bunch of guns. This is a heist novel that is also very character focused. So we follow like the main like heist crew, which is 6 characters. As you learn about them, you learn about their background, you learn about what makes them tick, what makes them want to go on this heist, and they are going to break in to this highly secure magical ice prison to get someone out. Incredibly fun, fantastic romantic subplots. A series that 100% rips your heart out and then pieces it back together and then rips it out again. It has a kind of dark vibe to it, but it is still YA, so it never gets like grimdark or to the point where it makes you feel uneasy the way some of the other books I'm going to mention will. Fun, fantasy, good times. Oh, now some people may ask, do you need to read Shadow and Bone first, which is the first trilogy by Lee Bardugo that takes place in the same world? I do think it enhances the experience if you read Shadow and Bone first, but you don't have to. I loved Shadow and Bone when I was 16, but I think there are better fantasy books out there, so that's why I mostly recommend this duology. I'm still so sad that the show got cancelled. Next up, I am going to recommend this fantasy series, adult epic fantasy series, A Darker Shade of Magic by V.E. Schwab. Here you are transported to a magic... Oh my god, I just realized this does actually also kind of take place in our world, but like barely, okay, because you are transported to magical Londons, plural. So we have our London, grey London, and then there's red London where there's magic. There is white London, but there's magic that is slowly corrupting it, and then black London, which basically disappeared because it was completely consumed and corrupted by dark magic. Most of the story takes place in red London, which is this really wonderful high fantasy version of London with all sorts of magic. There is elemental magic, there is mostly elemental magic. There are pirates, and there are a few people who have the magic to travel between the worlds, like our main character Kel, who we follow. This is classic epic adventure fantasy. We follow a bunch of characters going on quests, joining magical tournaments, fighting dangerous old dark wizards. It has one of my favorite redemption arcs. If you like redemption arcs, Zuko fans, looking at you. The romance in this is like very subtle, but it starts to live a little bit more in the second and the third book. Wow, I'm really holding these books up like, which one is which again? There is no other fantasy world that feels like this one because V.E. Schwab creates this very cool original idea of the 4 Londons. So if you're looking for more adventure and fun, these are great. The next series I'm going to be recommending is specifically for those who really liked the fave world of acotar and actually would like more world building in this fave world. Specifically, if you want a little more like classic folkloric type fave world building. You guys already know what I'm gonna say. The Cruel Prince! Again, it technically starts out in our world, but it feels like high fantasy because we spend most of the time following our human main character in the Fae world as she's trying to survive among these cruel, manipulative Fae. Like, these are the Fae from the folklore that we're used to scare off little children. These are the Fae that will lie to you, that will try to get your firstborn child. These are the Fae with sharp teeth that reside in swamps and bogs. But still, Holly Black is super light on her world building, so you're not gonna spend a lot of time having to learn about this world, I think, mainly because it is so rooted in real life folklore that we already know about, so she's not really coming up with new original things herself. But it makes it very easy to read. It is very political intrigue focused, it's fast paced. There is a romance subplot that is very enemies to lovers. If you love enemies to lovers in the sense that you're like, I genuinely very seriously want them to be enemies, like they hate each other. They don't start being warm to each other until like in the second book, something like that. Actually, do they ever become warm to each other? One may wonder. That is the type of romance plotline that The Cruel Prince has. That is the type of enemies to lovers. Okay, the lovers part is kind of dubious. They're fake, what can I say? If you want to jump into like a whole world with lots of books, you have this whole trilogy, and then there's another duology, The Stolen Heir, which takes place in the same world but now with different characters. Personally, if someone asks me about a book series with fae in them, I don't recommend acotar, I recommend The Cruel Prince. To me, The Cruel Prince is like young adult at its finest. Okay, another one, I have a lot in this category. Another one that is epic fantasy, great romantic plotline, original world but not too much world building. You already know it, I am very predictable. Rachel Gillick's One Dark Window and Two Twisted Crowns, another duology. If you don't want to get yourself into too much, you know? This one transports you to a world that is dark and misty, where people have monsters living in their heads, specifically our main character, where magic is wielded through cards, playing cards, and each card gives you a different ability. For all of you who watched Yu-Gi-Oh! As a child. Again, the world building is very simple, but it works. And especially if you're not looking for something too complex, this one hits the spot. To me, good world building in a fantasy books means that it feels original and it feels very specific to that series. I have a very specific image in my mind of what the world in One Dark Window looks like, with its crooked trees and a dangerous mist that claims people. The romance in the first book is like a nice additional subplot, and then in the second book it's a subplot, but oh my god, was it my favorite part of the book. Again, pure adventurous fun. And then the last one in this category that I want to recommend is Iron Widow. This leans more towards sci-fi, I would say sci-fi fantasy. It is a fantasy world, but we deal with mechas, so these giant like transformer like suits that the main characters, or like the characters in this world, can wear to battle in. They're like giant weapons, robot weapons that they go to war in. That in itself already very interesting world, but not insanely complicated. It is young adult, so it is easy to wrap your head around. It is easy to get into, and it's mostly very focused on very high octane action scenes. There's also a love triangle in this series where you genuinely don't know which way it is going to go, and that is because it's a love triangle that is an actual triangle, as in like the sides are touching, as in everyone is into everyone, which I think is a nice fresh take on tried romance plotlines. And then the last path that you can take 2 steps away from where we started is the path where you do want something like Fourth Wing and acotar, where it is fantasy, strong romantic subplots, the same balance, you just don't want the spice that those books have. Well then, I will just point you towards the genre of young adult fantasy. I am firmly of the belief that young adult fantasy is the original romantasy. Like, romantasy is not a new genre. Fantasy books in the young adult aisle have been romantasy for 10 plus years. YA fantasy tends to be high fantasy that is not super intricate in the world building. There is always a strong romantic subplot, and it doesn't have any spice if that's not what you want. A bunch of the books I already recommended were young adult, but the ones with specifically the same balance of romance and fantasy as Fourth Wing and acotar have, I would recommend To Kill a Kingdom. This one transports you to a world under the sea, actually, partially, because we are following a siren. Not only are we following the world under the ocean, the world of the mermaids, we are also following what is happening on the surface of the water, where you follow a pirate who is secretly a prince. It is very much a quest story, so we also go to different countries in this fantasy world, which I always really like. But at its core, this is an enemies to lovers romance story, because the whole point of the plot is that we follow this siren and then the prince who is a siren hunter. How could they ever trust each other? How are they gonna resolve the tension between them? Tales all this time, and I really like it. And kind of actually in the same vein, I would also recommend Heartless Hunter or The Crimson Moth if you're in the UK. This one takes you to a world of blood witches and blood witch hunters. There's a theme here. And then our main character is a blood witch who is a blood witch hunter. Are you following? That's as complex as it gets. The fantasy world here has a Viennese opera vibe to it. Since we get the dual point of view of the Blood Witch and the Blood Witch Hunter, most of the story is actually focused on the romance between them. I will say this one actually is pretty high on the romance, so maybe pick this up if you wanted a little more romance and a little less fantasy. But I'm just putting it in this category because it also doesn't have any spice. It is relatively mature, I would say, but it never gets explicit the way Fourth Wing and acotar do, while still having similar vibes as them. Before we take our third step into the realm of fantasy books, we must make a little excursion, a little in-between stop at a small island in the sea that is very breezy and cutesy, and just a little moment to relax, okay? This is the island for those of you that fell in love with fantasy because of the magic, because of the fun, because of the childlike sense of wonder that it gives you. You don't want it to be too dark. You don't want it to be romancy. You just want it to be magical. Then I invite you to stay, have a little vacation, a little magical vacation, if you will, on a middle grade fantasy island. In Nevermore, we follow Morrigan Crow, who is cursed to die on her 11th birthday. Okay, I know I just said that this was for if you don't like things that are too dark, and I know that this sounds really dark, but I will say for a middle grade novel, it is pretty dark, but like, for adult standards, it's not dark at all. But yeah, she is going to die on her 11th birthday. But then she doesn't. Huh? See? It's happy. She doesn't, and instead gets whisked away to this magical land of Nevermore, where she is going to compete to become a part of the Wondrous Society. A society for people with extraordinary magical talents, which she doesn't have, by the way. But she still has to compete in these trials. Oh my gosh, this is Powerless. I am describing Powerless. The romantasy book, Powerless, which I personally don't like. If you heard about the book Powerless and you're like, I like the concept of that. A girl who doesn't have any powers has to compete in magical trials and somehow make her way through without powers. You read Nevermore. It's the same concept. Except in Nevermore, she doesn't yet know what her powers are going to be. Anyway, it is fun, it is magical, she has to go through these trials. It has a very confetti magic type of feel. This is for those that want to read fantasy because they want to connect to their inner child. And I really do think this is one of those middle grade books that is fun no matter your age. Okay, we have reached the final step on our journey. We are taking the third step away. We are entering the edges of the map, the dark lands. This is where you take the Fae of acotar, the dragons of Fourth Wing, and really focus on what their political history is, what the intrigue intricacies of their magic system are. Here we have deep canyons of world building, little towns full of religion and history, huge forbidden libraries full of scrolls with different magic systems. You can spend a lot of time at this part of the map that is classic epic fantasy because there's just so much new interesting detail to take in. Most of these books are very light on the romance, maybe a little subplot here and there. And as we venture forth into this forest, I'm just gonna go through the rest of these books from like most easy to digest world building wise to the more harder to get into, which is not necessarily a bad thing. In many ways, that is like the strength of the books that we're gonna be talking about. Anyway, let's begin. Let's start with still a pretty easy to understand world. We have The Adventures of Amina al-Sirafi. This one takes you to a world of the sea, of piracy. The world of pirates, which is clearly also a theme with these books I'm recommending. I just really like stories that are about pirates, okay? And what I like about this book is that we have main characters that are like older than 18, you know? I think the main character is like, I imagined her to be like in her 50s, and she goes on like a final job where she gets together a crew of old friends who are all like middle-aged people, and they all go on this little pirate crew together on a heist to make a lot of money. This is fun, adventurous, a little wacky. It includes a lot of mythology. There's a very strong theme of how we can't trust legends and how history and legends are often embellished or told in favor of the people in power. But mostly it's a very high-stakes adventure epic. And it's got a pretty map. Ooh, do you see the pretty map? Yes. Oh, this does actually take place in our world. There's just magic. So again, it feels like high fantasy because of all the mythology and folklore that is real in this novel. Next, I'm going to be recommending Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. He, I think, is like the classic epic fantasy writer, and I'm gonna have to admit this is the only book I've read of him so far, and I really want to get more into his novels, but I'm like a little scared. But I know that he's like the king of cool, interesting world building. In Mistborn alone already we have this very cool magic system that is based on metals, where different metals give you different abilities. This is also another heist story. Okay, clearly I have my preferences, okay? Where you follow a bunch of different characters with varying skills going to plan a big revolution against the Dark Lord that basically won and is now ruling the country. This book, and I think most of Brandon Sanderson's books, are carried by the fun world building and magic system and the action. So if that's what you want, highly recommend this one. Next one, I have one for if you just want to read a standalone, okay? All of these fantasy books, they all have to be at least duologies, and at most they're like 14 books long, you know? If you just want to read a standalone, just one book, The Priory of the Orange Tree. Yes, I know, it is 800 pages, I can hear you say. That is still less than a trilogy that has a total of 1500 pages, okay? It's still less. And you kind of need 800 pages if you're gonna do as much cool world building as Samantha Shannon does with this. If you read Fourth Wing and were like, yes, dragons, I need more of them, and I want to know more about them, and I want to know about the wyverns as well, and the griffins, what is with all this cool dragon mythology, I raise you this book. Not only does this book contain kind of your classic European dragons, there's also a focus on more Eastern dragons. There's also dragons that are more inspired by East Asian mythology. It's a big world of many dragons, and in different part of the world the dragons are different, and the people are different, and their customs are different. The way Samantha Shannon creates myths in her stories and describes magic feels very reminiscent of Sarah J. Maas to me. It's very glittery, it's very aesthetically pleasing. And this one also has a really nice romance plotline. So I know this one may seem intimidating, but if you think about it, it's actually the least intimidating one of everything I mentioned in this video, because it's a standalone. A little while ago I mentioned that some of the books have like dark vibes, but it's not like grim dark. The next book I'm going to recommend is grim dark, but it's so good. It is The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. This is high fantasy inspired by Chinese history, specifically focused on the war between China and Japan. It is very, if you liked the war focus of Fourth Wing, this one goes into it a million times better in my opinion. You can tell that the author has studied Chinese history. We follow a main character as she joins a military school, just like in Fourth Wing. Everyone has different powers and she figures out the power that she has and has to learn to control it. I don't remember there being dragons in this, but there sure is a lot of magic and a lot of war. Fair warning, this is grim dark, so it gets genuinely really dark, but never just for shocking purposes. It always is there to tell a story. It never glorifies war, it actually shows how terrible, how awful it is. And they're based on real life events from history. Then I'm going to be recommending my absolute favorite. If from this entire video you would ask me, Leonie, which one of these fantasy books is your favorite? It's this series. The 5th season by N.K. Jemisin. There is no series like this one. There is no world, no magic system like this one. Like this, to me, this is what makes a good fantasy series. If it creates a world and a magic system that feels so original to the book, that feels so specific to this series. Just like with One Dark Window, I just have such a strong visual of what it looks like. This series takes you to a post-apocalyptic world where nature is fighting back, where people have harnessed the power of the earth, being able to create earthquakes. And there are so many more secrets about the magic. Weird floating obsidian crystals in the sky that no one truly understands. Stone-like people that are terrorizing everyone with how creepy they are. What I also appreciate about the series is the writing style. N.K. Jemisin's voice is so astounding, so unique to this world. And then on top of that, it also has very interesting themes about oppression, discrimination, changing history, what we have done to Mother Earth, motherhood in general. What themes are not in this, to be honest? It doesn't have like a fun, adventurous vibe to it. It is more kind of slowly getting to know different characters and the different power dynamics that exists in this world. And there is a lot of, you know, like calamity action going on. Definitely can take a while to get into because a lot of this world is a little bit confusing, but that is okay. You know, I love the process of slowly learning to understand everything. I have 2 books left to recommend, so we really are in like the realm of like, it's getting a little interesting with the world building, a little difficult to understand. Next up, I will recommend The Will of the Many. This is some more god tier world building, not in terms of magic systems this time, but more in terms of the political power structures that exist and how the magic is a direct extension of the power systems, because this entire world is a hierarchy and so is the magic. If you are up on the hierarchy, you basically siphon magic or will from the people beneath you, and the lower you are in the pyramid, the less magic you get, and you are kind of giving your magic away basically. And then on top of that, there are like weird creepy ruins, labyrinths underground. This entire book is like one big question mark, one big question of trying to understand what has happened in the past. The main character also doesn't know, but he is going to this like prestigious university to learn how to use his magic. It is not very magical. It is more magic in the sense of it helps you fight and it helps you stay vital. It is one of those books where you're like, yeah, okay, it's 600 pages, but we needed every single page of that. Like, we needed every single moment. Something that I can't say of some books. We needed every single scene to slowly get a picture of what this world is like and the different power dynamics between the characters. And finally, all the way at the end of this quest, I am going to recommend you read Dune. Maybe not the first thing you pick up after you've just gotten into fantasy through Fourth Wing. Or maybe if you finished Fourth Wing and you were like, actually, I want to know about the ecological circumstances in the soil that these dragons walked on. I want to know about the intricacies of the telepathic bond between the dragon and its rider and how that has been used by different parties over time. I want to know about what makes a rebel, what makes a rebellion leader. I want to know about how the imperialists take action. Actually, now that I'm mentioning all of these things, there are more fantasy parallels between Fourth Wing and Dune than I thought there would be. Basically, if you read Fourth Wing and was like, I want to know way more in-depth, interesting detail about every fantasy aspect here, because Fourth Wing has a lot of classic fantasy aspects that you also see in OG fantasies, like for example Dune. Dune is also a book about rebellion, a book about war, about imperialism, about lies that are being spread during wartime. It questions the idea of the rebellion leader, the Messiah. There may not be dragons, but there are really big worms and worm riders. I'm just saying, they are riding the worms, guys. It's like a rite of passage in this book that if you are like strong enough and you've proven yourself in trials, you get to ride the worm. And you might die in the process. Actually, way more parallels with Fourth Wing than you would expect. This is a slow book to get through, I will admit, but in the end, I do believe that it is worth it. And that brings us to the end of our journey. I hope you have found at least one book among all of my recommendations that you are gonna pick up next, and that will hopefully become your next new favorite fantasy novel. If there are more recommendations that you guys would like to share them in the comments so we can all help each other find our next new favorite fantasy read. What I've taken from filming this video is that I've been reading too many romantasy books lately and I need to get back into epic fantasy books. Maybe I will finally read a Brandon Sanderson book. Who knows? Anyway, I really hope that you enjoyed this video. I really hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you soon in another video very soon. Goodbye!